Now, I know there have been many of you that have been wondering since I did the Caleb Williams scouting report, well, if Caleb Williams isn't your QB1 in this draft, who is it? You may have just watched the J.D. Daniels scouting report and you saw clearly that it wasn't him, because it wasn't. Well, the man I'm about to talk about now, this is my QB1, and that is Drake Maye, which probably won't feel controversial for some, and it may feel controversial for others. Um, but he's my top guy. He's my QB1. I don't necessarily rate him significantly ahead of Caleb Williams based off of what I've observed the past couple of years. But I think there's just enough differentiation there that gives him the edge. But I will fully acknowledge that it comes with caveats, and that's not me trying to hedge. It's just like, it's a reality, right? It comes with some caveats, and it involves a certain level of projection and assumption. And sometimes you got to be careful with that because it can bite you in the ass. But let's talk about Drake Maye, because here's a guy, when you talk about the other quarterbacks in this class, he best fits the prototype height and weight for the position. And I know folks have different opinions on like how much that really matters. It matters at least somewhat, right? It is a positive versus a negative for him. And when you're looking for positives to check the box and say, you can't coach that, there's an Enzo Amore reference almost, right? And you can't teach that. He's 6'4", 220 plus pounds, and you can't teach that. But it's true though, right? He's got prototype height and weight for his position, where Caleb's a little short, Jaden Daniels is a little light, Bo Nix, J.J. McCarthy a little lacking on the height part too, right? Like, he's got the prototype, and especially when you extend that to other physical tools such as the arm talent. He's got legit high-end arm strength, arm talent. He can easily and comfortably make all the required NFL throws, whether that's within structure and on a solid platform, off platform, doesn't really matter. I've got his arm talent just a shade above Caleb Williams in this draft class. The arm talent matters. It absolutely matters. And the way I think about the quarterback position in relation to arm talent and in particular arm strength is pro golfers, the PGA Tour. And you could say, well, there's always these people that say you drive for show and putt for dough. And maybe there's something to that. But in reality, when you look at the history of the PGA Tour, when you look at the history of professional golf, especially on the men's side, there is far more of a correlation between the longest hitters in the game at that time being the most successful and in particular winning the most majors versus those guys that are based more off of like keep it straight off the tee, great iron player, great short game around the green. It's not saying some of those other things don't matter, but what that length off the tee does, similar to arm strength in the NFL, is it buys you some opportunity. It buys you some wiggle room. You can make mistakes that others can't and get away with them. And you see that now, like you're saying, oh, Scotty Scheffler's not a bomber, but yeah, but Scotty Scheffler is an incredible shot maker and this and that, but he also hasn't won a major outside of Augusta. And Augusta is perfectly suited for his game. But meanwhile, if you look, Brooks Koepka has won 5 majors, and he's an absolute beast off the tee. Dustin Johnson, won 2 majors at 2 different spots because of his length off the tee. Right? I can go on and on. Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, the two greatest major winners in golf history. Incredible length off the tee relative to their era. Phil Mickelson, 6 majors, bomber off the tee, right? I've already mentioned Koepka. Rory McIlroy, it's been a long time since he won a major, but he's always been one of the longest hitter on tour. He's got 4 majors. Like, this shit matters, and it buys them flexibility. It buys them the ability to make mistakes that others just can't get away with. It's a lot easier to say, I didn't hit it as straight, but you're 30 yards closer than your opponent is. Even if you get into a little bit of trouble, you can overcome that. The Seve Ballesteros approach. He was another big hitter, but he's an incredible shot maker too. My point is, when you look at Drake Maye and his elite arm talent, and he does have elite arm talent, that shit can compensate for a lot. So even when I get to his concerns and weaknesses, of which there are several and some that really concern me, it's one of those things, it's like a sliding scale. The more arm talent you have, the more it could compensate for some of these other things depending upon what they are. But beyond that physical profile, he showed the ability to hang tough in the pocket and make quality throws under duress. To me, he showed just enough feel for moving within the pocket to buy extra time. He was really good, I think, at times of executing within structure, whereas Caleb Williams really thrived outside of structure. Physical presence in the pocket, he's not easy to bring down. When he's on, his accuracy is actually pretty good to all three levels. Even if you look at the completion percentage statistics and you say, oh, they're not great, his drop rate was higher than some of the other quarterbacks in this draft class. Like that plays a role. But when he was on, yeah, he was really on and really impressive at all three levels. And what I also like about Maye is his accuracy does hold up relatively well when he is progressing past his first read. So he's going to his second read, his tertiary option. Like his accuracy holds up relatively well compared to Caleb, compared to other quarterbacks that went on to success at the NFL level. Also liked his ability to recognize where his check down was and get to it early, understood where the hot read was. He's a functional enough athlete to generate some yards with his feet. In terms of Drake Maye and his athleticism and how it translates, some probably think of it as better than others. I don't think he's totally a clodhopper, but I wouldn't say he's a graceful gazelle of an athlete either, if that makes sense. The other thing, though, and this is a big thing too, is he showed some real clutch ability in big spots over the past 2 years that you want from a franchise quarterback. Now he had some games you just cringe and say, oh my God, what the hell was that? True. But you also saw some performances where you say he could bring his team back multiple times. I think it was into the Duke game. He had to take his team late in the fourth quarter on multiple scoring drives, just get it to overtime. Like that type of shit. Like I saw some of that big time, don't shrink up in the moment type of performances from Drake Maye. And when you drafting a quarterback really high, you really want to make sure that he can come through in the big spots and go win you a game. You're not drafting a quarterback in the top 3 or 5 to say, I want to win games with him. You ultimately have to answer the question, how many games can you win because of him? That's what it comes down to. Like, we can get so much into like the different specifics of strengths and weaknesses and concerns and how shit translates. Here's the most important thing: it fucking translates. All the other shit you talk about is how many games will you win because of him? And if you think that number is high, then you got somebody. And if you think that number is low, then you got to be careful with it, right? That's the way I look at it. So I might sound pretty effusive in my praise, but I'd be remiss if I didn't sit there and say I've got some real concerns about him. His hands are a little small, so he could have some ball security and fumbling issues in bad weather, but that may not be much of a thing if he plays in warmer weather area or plays in a dome. He had some really bad, shoddy moments of decision making and showed a bit of an ability to make bad plays worse. So instead of just taking the sack or throwing the ball away, I think about the Minnesota game, he had at least one really horrendous pick where he's about to get sacked. Instead of just eating the sack or throwing the ball away, he tries to make a play and it gets picked off. You just can't have that shit. Mechanically, he throws from a narrow base. You'd like to see him widen that just a little bit to get a little more stable foundation there. I think it also would improve the consistency of his accuracy and his ball placement at all 3 levels. And he's got a bit of length in his throwing motion that he's got to sharpen up a little bit. He's got to get a little crisper there because it's about timing, right? And how quickly you can get rid of the ball. And if you struggle to do that at the NFL level, some of those windows you think you're throwing to are open aren't going to be open by the time the ball actually gets there. He's a bit heavy-footed in the pocket, too. That's another thing that stood out to me is that he could take a little bit to get going. Like, once he's going, he's okay. And, yeah, he can certainly pick up some yards with his feet. He can scramble. He can extend plays. But he can be a little quick to react with his feet, a little slow, to get going and get moving. So that's a concern, right? Is he going to take some big hits because he has to live primarily in the pocket? I think the big thing, though, to me is that he's got some really erratic moments where he's just all over the place. Similar to, I remember in years past with like Jordan Love at Utah State and Josh Allen at Wyoming. Like, you look at Drake Maye and you say, yeah, 2 years as a starter, like he shouldn't be this erratic. He's got moments he looks like a world beater and you would put him up there and you would say, how is this even a comparison? He's QB1 over Caleb Williams all day. And then you pop in some other games and you're like, his worst is a lot worse than Caleb Williams. You get what I mean? So you have to ask yourself, like, how often can he achieve that ceiling And how much does he end up like Drew Lock, basically? It's a fair question. His ball placement to non-stationary targets can lead a little something to be desired at times, I thought. I thought he was also a little up and down in terms of some of his processing. I know some people have said they really had problems with his processing. I didn't see it quite the same way, so this could be a difference of perspective or opinion. But I thought at times his processing could have been a little quicker. And I think that reflects a little bit when he has to improvise outside of the structure. That's where it's like, I'm anticipating and expecting this to happen, which will lead to that, right? And you can kind of pre-plan for that and be prepared for that. It's when it doesn't go quite to script, quite to plan, how does he do? I think he showed some ability to improvise, but not a frequency or consistency that I entirely feel comfortable with. And then you have to ask, like, a statistical regression in almost every category in 2023. Is that due to losing some of the offensive talent around him? Maybe, but still, it's a fair question. I won't knock, like when I get to the punchline here and I get to the point, I won't knock if some are lower on Drake Maye than I am. Because like I said, his footwork and his mechanics, they need work. His throwing motion needs work. His propensity for making bad plays worse, he's got to stop that, right? Like, these moments of just being all over the place have got to cut out. So when I see some people comparing him to a Drew Lock, I say that's where that's coming from. And you know what? That makes sense. In that respect, if you're only looking at the weaknesses and the concerns, and you go back and watch Drew Lock at Missouri, you're like, yeah, these guys line up pretty well as a prospect. But Drake Maye is bigger, more physical in the pocket. He's a much better natural thrower of the football. So that's where those Drew Lock comparisons ends. But if you're saying, hey, what's the floor might be Drew Lock, and that's not great, right? Or you say bigger Sam Howell. Could be, right? Although I will call out, like, with Sam Howell, a little more propensity to turn the ball over and take sacks. Drake Maye had less of that. My point here is when I talk similar with Jaden Daniels, and I was comparing him to like Marcus Mariota, and if I wanted to be generous, I could have said Alex Smith, but I thought Marcus Mariota is the guy that kept really standing out to me, right? When I looked at Jaden Daniels, some of those things that he needs to work on, you may not be able to work on. They may not be coachable or correctable, and instead you have to mask and hide them. For Drake Maye, these flaws, most of them, if not all of them, I think can be corrected. And that's a big difference, right? He's got the best pure arm talent in this draft. Anybody that tells you that's Caleb, I think is wrong, but I don't think it's that wide of a gap, right? It's not Michael Penix Jr. I think he's got good arm talent, but an entirely different level of prospect. He can make big time throws to all three levels. Here's a guy you can see the upside. And you can see a guy. And sometimes it's about feeling and gut and instinct, right? And sometimes that will lead you wrong. Like, I didn't pay close enough attention, frankly, with Zach Wilson and Trey Lance, two guys that had great physical tools a couple of years ago, and they both flamed out for different reasons, right? But I also was a huge proponent and champion for Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, and that's worked out really, really well. I was a big proponent for C.J. Stroud last year, and you could say, well, he didn't have massive physical tools. No, he had pretty solid physical tools, and then he was great at a lot of other things. And then I was big on Anthony Richardson, which initially, before the injuries, it looked like that guy could be a real goddamn difference maker, right? I was big on Herbert when it came to the physical tools. I was less so, but still pretty sold on Jordan Love, knowing that he needed work and he needed time. And ironically enough, I think that's the comparison I come up with. I know for Drake Maye, there's going to be a lot of comparisons all over the place. Is it Drew Lock? Is this floor? Is this ceiling somebody like a Justin Herbert? There are certainly similarities there in terms of sometimes you would see Justin Herbert at Oregon dominate and you're like, holy shit. And then other times you're like, what the fuck is this? This is a top-rated quarterback prospect? I agree. I see some of that with Drake Maye, right? But I think Jordan Love's a little closer to the mark. I think Herbert's got a little more arm talent than Drake Maye. I think he was a little bit better in processing and functioning as a pure pocket passer than a Drake Maye is. But you could see the potential with Jordan Love. You just knew there was going to be a lot of work that needed to happen. I say the same thing with Drake Maye. I'm going to still bet on that upside because at the end of the day, those physical tools really do matter. And the flaws that he has for the most part, to me at least, in my opinion, are correctable. And some team is going to regret passing on Drake May in this year's draft.